Hello students, welcome to the Chapter 6 lecture. In this lecture I'm covering the integumentary system, which is the skin and associated structures such as sweat glands and hair follicles. I'm going to be covering the functions and structure of the integumentary system, and I'm going to be breaking this lecture up into two separate recordings. So this is kind of our first major body system that we're looking at in this class. Previously, we've covered an orientation to the human body, some basic cell biology, histology, and this leads us into kind of our first in-depth look at one of the body systems. So the integumentary system, like I said, this is skin and associated structures. And this is a fairly straightforward system of the body. It's probably the system that we're all the most familiar with in terms of what it does and the parts involved. Okay, so first I'd like to cover functions of the integumentary system. And just some basic information. Integument is basically another term for skin. So integumentary system refers to the skin and its associated structures. One of the more intuitive functions of the skin, of course, is simply as a protective layer. It helps to keep microbes and other pathogens out. It helps to retard water loss. It protects us to some extent from physical injury. So one of the major systems, or rather functions of the integumentary system, is simply going to be protection. And there are three different forms of barriers that I'll be covering here. One is the skin acts as a chemical barrier. This is due to the fact that it produces secretions that are low in pH. And remember when we studied the pH scale, we learned that things that are low on the pH scale are acidic, and things that are high on the pH scale are more basic or alkaline. So our skin actually produces secretions that contribute to having a low pH on the surface of our skin, and that acts as a chemical barrier for a lot of pathogens. Most pathogens cannot really survive in an acidic environment. And this set of secretions and resulting chemical environment is known as the acid mantle. The skin also produces dermcidins and defensins, which are antimicrobial peptides. So these are basically amino acids that are strung together. Peptide refers to proteins, so they are basically like small proteins that function to retard bacterial and fungal activity. The skin also acts as a physical and mechanical barrier. So we have, of course, our epidermis is comprised of stratified, squamous, epithelium. And if you think back to our study of histology, would this be keratinized or non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium? If you say it's keratinized, you are correct. It's keratinized because the further our epidermal skin cells get from the basal layer, the further removed they are from having a source of nutrients and waste removal functionality, and basically those skin cells will just become packed with keratin at a certain point. They become metabolically inactive, so they're basically dead cells at that point, and they help to form this waterproof barrier that also helps protect against physical trauma. So we have keratin and glycolipids that block most water as well as water-soluble substances. We do have limited penetration of the skin by lipid-soluble substances. This can be good or bad. Plant oleoresins like poison ivy can penetrate the skin. Some organic solvents, salts of heavy metals, and some drugs. So while some drugs are going to be therapeutic, there are, nicotine patches, for example, that can be absorbed via the skin for addressing nicotine dependence. There are motion sickness drugs that are actually delivered via skin patches as well. We can also have toxins and heavy metals that actually get into our skin, and other substances such as nail polish remover, for example, acetone, can be absorbed into the skin. So, depending on the context, of course, this can be a good thing or a bad thing. But for the most part, our skin is a fairly effective physical barrier to most substances. And then another function of the integumentary system is the fact that it is a biological barrier. So this means that bacteria, for example, can be deterred by dendritic cells and macrophages. Dendritic cells are immune cells that originate in our bone marrow, and they will actually migrate to the epidermis and epithelia of, for example, our oral cavity, and they will alert the immune system to the presence of toxins and microbes. And then macrophages are derived from white blood cells. Macro means large, and phage literally means eating. So basically they are cells that will seek out and ensnare bacteria and cellular debris and actually digest those things. So they are you can think of them as large eating cells. They'll digest potentially harmful bacteria as well as cellular debris. Another function of the integumentary system is simply for body temperature regulation. Even if we are not producing sweat that is really detectable through our senses, we still produce about 500 milliliters of sweat a day, and this is known as insensible perspiration. So this is perspiration that doesn't really have an offensive odor to it. It's just normally produced at regular body temperature to help keep our bodies cool. And then, of course, at elevated temperature or in cases of stress, for example, we'll see dilation of the dermal blood vessels. Remember that dilation basically means to increase diameter. So if you have an increase in diameter of your dermal vessels, that means you have increased blood flow. And because blood is mostly water, it holds a lot of heat in. And with dilation of those dermal vessels, you have basically a cooling mechanism. So you are able to release more body heat. And that just helps maintain homeostasis. So then we also have increased sweat gland activity. This would be the sensible perspirations, meaning sweat that you can generally smell. But this, of course, serves a very important function. It helps to cool the body. So again, this is relating to the maintenance of those normal parameters known as homeostasis. A third function of the integumentary system is for cutaneous sensations. So we have encapsulated nerve endings as well as free nerve endings that help us sense such stimuli as temperature, touch, and pain. And we'll be talking more about these specialized nerve cells when we get to the nervous system, but basically these are extensions of our neurons that help us to sense various stimuli and respond appropriately. We also have some metabolic functions of the integumentary system. Synthesis of vitamin D precursor. So vitamin D is going to be produced with exposure to sunlight, for example. and then collagenase, which is an enzyme that will actually help to break down collagen, so it's responsible for normal collagen turnover. And we also have chemical conversion of some carcinogens and some hormones that take place within the integumentary system. A fifth function would be just to act as a blood reservoir. So up to 5% of our total blood volume will be contained within the integument. And then sixth, we have excretion. Remember, an excretion is a substance produced by the body that is typically a waste product. So we have nitrogenous wastes and salt that we excrete via our sweat glands. Okay, now let's cover some basic anatomy of the skin or integument. So it consists of three major regions. We have the epidermis, which is the most superficial region, the dermis, which is the middle region, and then the hypodermis, also known as the superficial fascia, which is the deepest region. So hypo, when you see that term hypo, think below. And this is also known as the subcutaneous or sub-Q layer, which is technically not part of the skin. So it's deep to the skin. And mostly the hypodermis is adipose tissue. Adipose, of course, is just fat. So these are cells that are specialized for storing triglycerides. So here's a basic illustration of layers of the skin. Epidermis is going to be our outermost layer. This is going to be comprised of the stratified squamous epithelium, which is keratinized. Then we have our dermis, which is mostly going to be connective tissue. There's two different layers, the papillary layer and the reticular layer, which I'll cover shortly. And then the hypodermis, again, that's also known as the superficial fascia. That is mostly going to be comprised of adipocytes. So the fat cells here that you see illustrated in yellow. So as you can see, most of the specialized structures of the skin are going to be within this middle layer known as the dermis. And there are some structures that are actually derivatives of the epidermis. So you can see here basically the hair follicle extends down from the epidermal layer, but our erector pili muscles, which are responsible for raising our hair, in the case of goosebumps, for example, these are going to originate in the dermis. We're also going to have nerves and blood supply in the dermal layer as well. All right, so the epidermis is comprised of stratified squamous epithelium, which is keratinized. Remember back to our histology studies, stratified just refers to the fact that there's more than a single layer of cells. Squamous refers to these sort of flattened scale-like cells. So that's just the basically the cell shape. And then epithelium, this is the type of tissue that is specialized for lining and covering parts of the body. It's keratinized because the outermost layers of these cells are actually dead skin cells that are packed with these keratin fibers, and that's a type of protein. So the cells of the epidermis, we have our stem cells. These are found in the deepest layer only, and they give rise to keratinocytes, which are the cells that actually are going to be packed with keratin. So keratinocytes are going to be producing this fibrous protein known as keratin. Melanocytes are responsible for producing the pigment known as melanin. So that's responsible for a lot of our darker pigmentation. About 10 to 25% of cells in the lower epidermis are going to be melanocytes. And then we also have epidermal dendritic, also known as Langerhans cells. These are macrophages that help to activate the immune system. So they help to form part of this biological barrier. And we also have tactile or Merkel cells, which are touch receptors. So these are going to be specialized parts of our nervous system that assist us in sensing stimuli related to touch. So I'm going to be covering the layers of the epidermis. What we see here are 4 layers. These are the 4 layers that are found in thin skin, which is basically most of the skin of our body is thin skin with a few exceptions. So like the palms and the soles of our feet are actually thick skin, and they'll have a 5th layer, but most of our skin most of our epidermis rather just has these 4 layers. So here we see the dermis, that's that thick middle layer, and then everything superficial to that will be our epidermis. And then you also see here desmosums. Those are cell junctions that are responsible for forming a really tight waterproof barrier to our outer layers of skin. We have melanocytes, which are the cells that produce melanin. We have the keratinocytes, which produce keratin. And then we'll also have, for example, epidermal dendritic cells help to form a biological barrier, sensory nerve endings, and tactile cells. Okay, so with layers of the epidermis, we have the stratum basale, which is the basal layer. So this is the deepest layer of epidermis, which is right up against the dermis. So it's going to be firmly attached to the dermis. It consists of a single row of stem cells and keratinocytes. It's also called the stratum germinativum, which think of, in gardening, think of germination. So if a seed is growing, it is germinating. And similarly, we have cells here that are undergoing rapid division. So these stem cells are ultimately responsible for the proliferation of cells in more superficial layers of the epidermis. And I mentioned in our histology lecture how the further you get from the dermis, the older the cells are, and eventually those epidermal cells are going to be so far away from their supportive connective tissue that they no longer have an adequate blood supply, nutrient supply, and waste removal mechanism, and those cells eventually die. So this journey from the basal layer all the way to the top of the epidermis takes anywhere from 25 to 45 days. So that's basically going to be your lifespan of a typical epidermal skin cell. The stratum spinosum, which is also known as the prickly layer, are going to be cells that contain a web-like system of intermediate pre-keratin filaments that are attached to those cell junctions known as desmosums. So desmosums are just specialized proteins that link one cell to another. Pre-keratin means these are filaments that will eventually lead to actual keratin. They are also this layer of the skin is also going to have abundant melanin granules as well as dendritic cells. So melanin is going to be that pigment that's produced by melanocytes. I'll be covering the functionality of melanin in a little bit more depth later on, but basically it helps to protect our DNA from UV radiation and other damage. So it is actually going to help protect our DNA from damage from the sun, and that in turn is going to help protect us from spontaneous mutations that could arise due to that damage. The stratum granulosum, or granular layer, is a fairly thin layer of the epidermis, just 3 to 5 cell layers thick, in which the cells flatten out. We have keratohyalin and lamellated granules accumulating here. Keratohyalin granules produce a protein known as filaggrin, which binds to keratin filaments and basically bundles those filaments together. So that's one of the first steps in creating this tough outer layer of our epidermis. And then lamellated granules help to retard water loss. Then we have the stratum lucidum, which is known as the clear layer. This is only going to be found in thick skin, so for example, the palms and the soles of the feet. This is a thin, transparent band that is superficial to the stratum granulosum, and it's just a few rows of flat, dead keratinocytes. So it is going to contribute to the extra thickness in certain regions of the body. Okay, next we have the stratum corneum or horny layer. This is the most superficial layer of skin. This is comprised of 20 to 30 rows of dead, flat, keratinized membranous sacs. So rather than a metabolically active, fully functional cell, you basically have those keratin bundles replacing the functional units within cells. But it's still going to be really important for acting as a physical barrier. So about 3/4 of the epidermal thickness is made up of this stratum corneum. The functions, of course, are to help protect the body from abrasion and penetration, waterproofs, so it retards water loss and basically creates a waterproof barrier as well, and it's a barrier against biological, chemical, and physical assaults, which I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture. So just to review, and again, these are the 4 layers that are found in both thick and thin skin. You'll find the 5th layer in thick skin as well, which is the stratum lucidum. We have the stratum basale. This is the layer that's closest to the dermis. So this is where you actually have the division of these stem cells occurring and proliferating. So it's responsible for the cellular turnover within the epidermis. We have the stratum spinosum. We have the stratum granulosum, and then the stratum corneum. So in our histology slides, I basically describe this outermost layer of the stratified squamous epithelium that's keratinized as looking rather wispy. That is going to be due to this stratum corneum. These are just the keratin-packed dead cells that form that waterproof barrier. Okay, so I've just covered the epidermis, which is the outermost layer of skin. Now we'll move on to the dermis itself. This is comprised of strong, flexible connective tissue. So we're no longer looking at epithelial tissue, we're looking at different types of connective tissues. Cells in the dermis are going to include fibroblasts, which are cells that are found in connective tissue that produce collagen and other fibers. So fibroblast, think of them as blasting out fibers. They are actually going to be producing a lot of the tough proteins that lend both structure and function and resiliency to a lot of our connective tissues. We have those macrophages, large eating cells that help to ensnare bacteria, for example. Occasionally, we also have mast cells. These produce a number of chemicals such as heparin, that is going to inhibit blood clotting, and then it also produces histamine, which we're probably familiar with if we are familiar with allergic reactions, but histamine basically increases blood flow via vasodilation. And then white blood cells. So white blood cells are going to be involved in immune function. Okay, so there are 2 layers here. We have the papillary layer of the dermis and the reticular layer. And again, looking back at the schematic here, we're now covering the dermis, which is where a lot of the specialized structures are going to be found. The papillary layer is this very thin superficial most layer of the dermis, and the reticular layer is most of the thickness here. The papillary layer consists of areolar connective tissue with collagen as well as elastic fibers and blood vessels, so it's only about 20% of the thickness of the dermis. The dermal papillae will contain capillary loops. Capillaries are our smallest blood vessels, and they are responsible for basically the perfusion of tissues with oxygen. They provide for nutrient delivery and waste removal. We have Meissner's corpuscles, which are a specific type of mechanoreceptor. So again, these are going to be specialized neurons. So they help to sense stimuli, mechanical stimuli. In this case, they are responding to light touch. And there's also going to be free nerve endings, which respond to other stimuli. Then we have the reticular layer, about 80% of the thickness of the dermis. You're going to see collagen fibers in the reticular layer that provide strength and resiliency. And you're also going to see elastic fibers that provide for stretch recoil properties. Okay, moving on to skin color. There are 3 pigments that help contribute to skin color. One of those is melanin. The hues that show up as a result of melanin can vary quite a bit. We generally think of melanin as producing the darker skin tones, but melanin is basically yellow to reddish brown to black. It's produced in the specialized cells known as melanocytes. Remember, anytime you see that term site, think cell. So these are just cells that produce melanin. So they're produced in melanocytes. The melanin itself actually migrates to keratinocytes, where it forms what are known as pigment shields for the nuclei. So nuclei, of course, is where our DNA is. The majority of our cell's DNA is found in the nucleus. And the reason why melanin is going to be found shielding the nuclei is because it actually helps to form a barrier against UV radiation. So ultraviolet radiation that is potentially damaging to our DNA. It's basically going to help shield our cell DNA from that harmful radiation, which could potentially cause mutations that could lead to cancer. It's also responsible for just normal freckles as well as pigmented moles. And you're going to see it localized in certain areas of the skin. Another pigment that we find in skin is known as carotene. Carrot, basically. This might help you remember the typical color that this lends to skin. It's yellow to orange. This is going to be most obvious in the palms and the soles. And then a third pigment that we see is hemoglobin. This is responsible for the pinkish hue of skin. And hemoglobin, of course, is actually the oxygen-carrying pigment within our red blood cells. So this is a specific type of protein that, due to its iron functional group, is going to have an affinity for oxygen, and it's going to help deliver oxygen throughout the body. One of the most obvious places that you see hemoglobin being responsible for the pinkish hue of skin is actually in the lips, because the skin of our lips is very thin, and as a result we can actually see the hemoglobin in the blood showing through that thin skin more. So those are those three three pigments that lend us our normal coloration. There's also going to be a number of kind of abnormal colorations due to a number of conditions that can occur. So how can skin color be used as a clinical tool? Some of you might already have an idea of cyanosis or jaundice, for example. Cyanosis would be a bluish tint. That might be due to lack of oxygen. If you have an obstruction within the heart, for example, or a blood vessel such that oxygenated blood is not being delivered where it needs to be, cyanosis or that bluish tint might occur. Jaundice, if there's something wrong with the liver and it's not disposing of metabolic wastes as normal, that can produce that yellow hue that's especially apparent in the whites of the eyes and the skin. There's also, of course, you know, in instances of exercise or even embarrassment, there's the case where you have a greater perfusion of blood close to the surface of the skin, and that can produce more of a reddish color. Also pallor, which would be pale skin, and that might be due to lack of oxygen as well in some cases. So there are a number of kind of fairly obvious signs that you can look for in a clinical setting that might be indicative of certain problems. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and I'm going to pick up with a second lecture video that is going to start off with appendages of the skin. As always, please let me know if you have any questions, and thank you for listening.